Sarah, Sarah, that's what I heard the first night. My own name, carried on the wind like a prayer, or maybe a warning. I'm Sarah Chen, 26, and I thought I was just taking a temporary lighthouse keeper position in Marblehead, Massachusetts to clear my student debt and figure out my life. I never expected to become part of a story that's haunted this rocky coastline for over a century. Let me tell you what really happened at Beacon Point Light, because after 3 months of sleepless nights and encounters I can't explain, I need someone else to know the truth. The job nobody wanted. It was October 2024 when I found the posting on an obscure maritime jobs board. Lighthouse Keeper, Beacon Point Light, Marblehead, MA. Seasonal position, October-March. Housing provided. Previous applicants need not reapply. That last line should have been my first red flag, but I was desperate. My marketing degree wasn't paying the bills. My Boston apartment was bleeding me dry, and frankly, 6 months of solitude sounded appealing after my relationship imploded. The Coast Guard officer who interviewed me, Captain Morrison, was in his 60s with weathered skin and eyes that seemed to look right through you. He kept emphasizing that it was just an automated beacon now, and my job was mainly maintenance and weather reporting. When I asked why the position kept opening up, he just said people found the isolation challenging. Have you ever experienced anything unusual out there? I asked, trying to seem casual. Morrison paused, his pen hovering over my application. Beacon Point has a long history, Miss Chen. Some folks are more sensitive to that history than others. He signed the papers quickly. You start Monday, Mrs. Henley will show you round. First night at the light. Mrs. Henley was the kind of elderly local who seemed to know every secret the town had ever kept. She drove me out to Beacon Point in her ancient Buick, chattering nervously the entire way about grocery deliveries and radio protocols. The lighthouse sat on a jagged outcrop of rock, about 2 miles from the main harbor, connected to shore by a narrow causeway that disappeared during high tide. Beautiful, isn't it? She said as we pulled up, but her voice carried no conviction. The lighthouse was a classic white tower, maybe 60 feet tall, with a small keeper's house attached at the base. Paint was peeling, shutters hung crooked, and the whole structure seemed to lean slightly away from the ocean, as if recoiling from something in the water. The keeper's quarters were sparse but functional: a kitchen, living room, bedroom, and a small office with the radio equipment. Mrs. Henley showed me how to operate the automated beacon controls and the weather monitoring station, speaking quickly like she wanted to finish and leave. Now, about the history. She began, then stopped herself. Well, you can read about it in the log books. Previous keepers sometimes left notes. She handed me a key ring and headed for the door. I'll be back Thursday with supplies. Radio check is every morning at 8. Mrs. Henley, wait, I called. What about the history you mentioned? She paused in the doorway, silhouetted against the gray October sky. The Esperanza went down in 1902, just off those rocks there. 23 souls lost, including a young woman named Elena Vasquez. She was coming to America to marry a fisherman in the village. Mrs. Henley's voice dropped to almost a whisper. They say she still waits for him on stormy nights. Then she was gone, leaving me alone with the sound of waves and that name echoing in my head, Elena. The first incident, that first night, I tried to settle in. I made dinner, explored the lighthouse. The lamp room at the top offered a spectacular view of the rocky coastline, and started reading through the log books Mrs. Henley had mentioned. Most entries were routine weather reports and maintenance notes, but scattered throughout were stranger observations. October 15, 1987. Heard singing during the storm last night. Couldn't locate source. Beacon functioning normally. R. Patterson. November 3rd, 1993. Footprints in sand around base of lighthouse. Size 6 women's shoe. No visitors scheduled. M. Torres. December 12th, 2019. She was there again, on the rocks, watching. I can't do this anymore. J. Sullivan. The entries gave me chills, but I rationalized them. Lighthouse keepers were often isolated people, prone to seeing things that weren't there. I was a logical person. I had a degree in marketing, for crying out loud. I didn't believe in ghosts. That confidence lasted exactly until 2:47 a.m. I woke to the sound of my name being called. Not shouted, not whispered, just called, clear as day, as if someone were standing in my bedroom. Sarah, Sarah. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and listened. The lighthouse was silent except for the eternal crash of waves. I checked the radio, nothing. I looked outside, nothing but darkness and the rhythmic sweep of the automated beacon. But then I saw her. A figure stood on the rocky outcrop about 50 yards from the lighthouse, directly in the path of the beacon's sweep. Every 12 seconds, the light would illuminate her, a woman in a long, dark dress, her hair whipping in the wind, facing the ocean. When the light moved on, she vanished into darkness, only to reappear on the next sweep. I grabbed binoculars and focused on the spot. When the beacon swept around again, she was still there, but now she was facing the lighthouse, facing me. Even from that distance, I could see her face clearly in the powerful light. She was young, maybe 25, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to bore right through the binoculars into my soul. Her dress was soaked, clinging to her frame, and seaweed hung from her arms like jewelry. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then the beacon moved on, and when it returned, she was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The research begins. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream, or maybe someone playing a prank. But when I radioed in my weather report, I found myself asking Mrs. Henley about Elena Vasquez. "Oh, you've heard about her already," she said, and I could hear the concern in her voice even through the static. "What exactly did you hear?" I decided not to mention what I'd seen, just that she died in the Esperanza wreck. "Do you know anything else about her story?" There was a long pause. She was 19, from a small village outside Barcelona, engaged to marry Thomas Cabral, a Portuguese fisherman who'd settled in Marblehead. The ship ran aground during a nor'easter on October 28, 1902. Elena's body was never recovered. Never recovered? The currents around Beacon Point are treacherous. Bodies that go down there, sometimes they stay down. Sometimes they wash up weeks later, sometimes never. Elena was one of the nevers. That afternoon, I drove into Marblehead proper and spent hours at the Historical Society. The librarian, a woman named Patricia who looked like she'd been there since the lighthouse was built, helped me find newspaper clippings from 1902. The Esperanza had been a passenger ship carrying Spanish and Portuguese immigrants to Boston. The storm that sank her was described as the worst nor'easter in living memory. The ship had tried to make for Marblehead Harbor, but was driven onto the rocks by massive waves and hurricane-force winds. But it was a smaller article, buried in the back pages of the Marblehead Messenger dated November 15, 1902, that made my blood run cold. Lighthouse keeper reports strange sighting. Mr. Jeremiah Blackwood, keeper of Beacon Point Light, reported to authorities this week that he has observed a woman in distress on the rocks near the lighthouse during the recent storms. Sheriff's deputies investigated but found no evidence of survivors from the Esperanza wreck. Mr. Blackwood insists the woman appears solid as life and seems to be searching for something in the waves. Authorities believe the tragedy has affected the keeper's mental state. There were similar reports from lighthouse keepers in 1918, 1935, 1967, and 1983. Always during storms, always a woman on the rocks, always searching. The pattern emerges. Over the next 2 weeks, I developed a routine. During clear weather, nothing happened. The lighthouse was just a lighthouse. The rocks were just rocks, and I was just a woman doing a job. But when storms approached, everything changed. It started with the feeling of being watched. Then came the sounds, footsteps on the gallery outside the lamp room, even though I was the only person for miles. Soft crying that seemed to come from the walls themselves. And always, always, the sound of my name being called, Sarah. Sarah, the figure on the rocks, appeared during every storm, and I began to study her with the dedication of a scientist. She always appeared in the same spot, always wore the same soaked dress, always stared out at the ocean with that heartbreaking expression of longing. But there were variations. Sometimes she would turn toward the lighthouse and raise her hand, as if waving. Sometimes she would cup her hands around her mouth as if calling out, though I never heard words beyond my name. And once, during a particularly violent storm in early November, she began walking toward the lighthouse. I watched through binoculars as she picked her way across the rocks, moving with purpose despite the crashing waves. She moved like someone who knew these rocks intimately, never stumbling, never hesitating. As she got closer, I could see details that defied explanation. Her dress wasn't just wet, it was tattered, as if she'd been tumbling in the surf for decades. Her skin had a translucent quality that made her seem both solid and ethereal. And her eyes held a desperate intelligence, like someone trying to communicate something vital but lacking the words. She stopped about 20 feet from the lighthouse door and looked up at the lamp room where I stood. For a moment, we just stared at each other through the storm. Then she raised her hand and pointed toward the water, toward the rocks where the Esperanza had gone down. When I looked in that direction, then back to her, she was gone. The discovery, I started having dreams after that. Not nightmares exactly, but vivid, realistic dreams where I was walking through the lighthouse at night, following the sound of crying. In the dreams, I would find a door I'd never noticed before, hidden behind a tapestry in the basement. Behind the door was a small room filled with objects from shipwrecks, pieces of hull, personal effects, and in the center, a wooden chest with EV carved into the lid. The dreams were so realistic that I began exploring the lighthouse during the day, looking for that hidden door. The basement was mostly used for storage, old equipment, spare parts for the beacon, boxes of records dating back decades. But in the furthest corner, behind a stack of moldering life preservers, I found something interesting. The wall wasn't quite right, while the rest of the basement was constructed from fitted stone blocks. The section had been bricked up with different materials, red brick instead of gray stone, and the mortar looked newer. When I knocked on it, it sounded hollow. I spent 2 days carefully chipping away the mortar with tools from the maintenance kit. Behind the bricks, I found exactly what my dreams had shown me. A small room, maybe 6 feet by 8 feet, with a low ceiling. The smell hit me first. Salt air and decay, so strong it made my eyes water. The room contained dozens of objects clearly salvaged from shipwrecks, pieces of ship's wheels, brass fittings green with verdigris, waterlogged books, and personal items like jewelry and photographs. And in the center, just as I dreamed, sat a wooden chest with EV, carved into the lid. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were Elena's personal effects. A letter written in Spanish which I couldn't read, but recognized as a love letter based on the tone. A small silver cross. A photograph of a young woman who looked exactly like the figure I'd been seeing on the rocks. And at the bottom, a ship's manifest with her name. Elena Vasquez, age 19, passenger aboard Esperanza, destination Boston, Massachusetts. But it was the final item that explained everything. A leather-bound journal, written in English in a careful, masculine hand. The first entry was dated November 1st, 1902. My name is Jeremiah Blackwood, and I am the keeper of Beacon Point Light. I have done something terrible, and I must record it here, for I can no longer bear the weight of this secret alone. When the Esperanza went down, I was in the lamp room, trying to keep the beacon lit through the storm. I saw people in the water, struggling against the waves. Most were swept away immediately, but one, a young woman, managed to reach the rocks below the lighthouse. She was barely alive when I pulled her from the water, hypothermic, injured, but breathing. I brought her here, to the lighthouse, and tried to warm her, tried to save her. For 3 days, she drifted in and out of consciousness, speaking in Spanish, calling for someone named Thomas. On the 3rd day, she woke fully. She was beautiful, more beautiful than any woman I had ever seen. She told me her name was Elena, that she had come to America to marry a fisherman in the village. She was grateful for my rescue, sweet and kind despite her situation. I fell in love with her in those 3 days, completely, utterly in love. When she spoke of her Thomas, of her plans to marry him, I felt something dark twist in my chest. How could I let her go? How could I let her leave me alone in this lighthouse forever? When the rescue boat came looking for survivors, I hid her in the basement. I told them no one had made it to shore alive. I convinced myself I was protecting her, that she was too weak to travel, that she needed more time to recover. But Elena was not weak. When she realized what I had done, she fought to leave. She screamed for help, tried to signal passing boats. I could not let her expose my lies. I could not let her leave me. I never meant to hurt her. I only meant to make her sleep, to give her something to calm her while I explained, while I made her understand how much I loved her. But I gave her too much of the sleeping draft. When I checked on her the next morning, she was cold. I have buried her body beneath the lighthouse, in the rocks where no one will ever find her. I have kept her possessions, told myself I am honoring her memory. But I know the truth. I am a murderer. She appears to me now during storms. She stands on the rocks where I first found her, searching. I think she is looking for a way home, a way to her Thomas. She cannot rest while her body lies hidden and her death goes unmarked. I am sorry, Elena. I am so very sorry. The journal continued for several more entries, documenting Jeremiah's descent into madness as Elena's appearances became more frequent and more demanding. The final entry was dated December 15, 1902. She came inside tonight. I was in the lamp room when I heard footsteps on the stairs. She appeared in the doorway, still wearing that ruined dress, still dripping seawater on my floor. "Where is my body, Jeremiah?" she asked. Her voice was like the sound of waves on shingle. I could not answer. I could not even look at her. I cannot rest until I am properly buried. I cannot find my way to Thomas until my body is returned to the earth. I know what I must do. I know how to make this right. Tomorrow, when the tide is low, I will dig her up from beneath the lighthouse. I will give her a proper burial in the village cemetery. I will tell them the truth, but I fear it may be too late for redemption. I fear she will not forgive me, even in death. If anyone finds this journal, know that Elena Vasquez was a good woman who deserved better than the fate I gave her. Know that her death weighs on my soul like a stone, and that I see her face every time I close my eyes. May God forgive me, for I cannot forgive myself. There were no more entries. According to the historical records I'd read, Jeremiah Blackwood had disappeared in December 1902. His body was found 3 days later, washed up on the rocks. Below the lighthouse, the official cause of death was accidental drowning, but now I wondered if it had been suicide, driven by guilt and haunted by Elena's spirit. The confrontation. That night, as if summoned by my discovery, Elena appeared inside the lighthouse for the first time. I was sitting in the kitchen, trying to process what I'd learned, when I heard footsteps in the stairwell leading to the lamp room. Slow, deliberate footsteps, accompanied by the sound of dripping water. Every instinct told me to run, but I forced myself to stay calm. I grabbed a flashlight and followed the sounds upstairs. She was standing in the lamp room, silhouetted against the massive beacon lens. In the close confines of the lighthouse, she seemed more solid, more real than she had on the rocks. I could see the individual threads in her tattered dress, the way her dark hair clung to her shoulders, the pale blue tint of her waterlogged skin. "Sarah," she said, and her voice was exactly what I'd imagined, soft, accented, carrying the sound of distant waves. "You found them, Elena." My voice came out as barely a whisper. She turned toward me, and in the rotating light of the beacon, I saw her face clearly for the first time. She was beautiful, just as Jeremiah had written, but her beauty was heartbreaking. Her dark eyes held more than a century of sadness, of waiting, of unfinished business. "You found my belongings. You know what he did." I nodded, not trusting my voice. "I have been waiting," she continued, "waiting for someone to learn the truth, waiting for someone to help me find peace. What do you need me to do? My body lies beneath this lighthouse, in the rocks where he hid me. I need to be found. I need to be buried properly, in consecrated ground, so that I can rest. I'll help you," I said immediately. "I'll call the police, tell them what I found. They'll excavate, they'll find you." But Elena shook her head sadly. "It is not that simple. Jeremiah bound me to this place with his lies, with his obsession. Even if my body is found, even if I am buried properly, I cannot leave while the truth remains hidden." "What truth?" "Thomas," she whispered, and the name seemed to cause her physical pain. "My Thomas. He never knew what happened to me. He waited for years, searching for answers. He died still believing I had abandoned him, that I had chosen death over marriage to him. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October night. Thomas is dead. That was over a century ago. But his family remains. His descendants. They live still in Marblehead, carrying the shame of a bride who never came, who seemingly chose death over love. The story has been passed down. Elena Vasquez, the faithless woman who killed herself rather than marry their ancestor. That's not what happened. No. But it is what they believe. And their belief, their pain, keeps me bound here as surely as Jeremiah's crime. Elena moved closer, and I could feel the cold radiating from her like an open freezer. You must tell them the truth. You must clear my name and Thomas's heart, even in death. The investigation, the next morning. I called in sick to my radio check with Mrs. Henley and drove into Marblehead. I needed to find Thomas Cabral's descendants and somehow convince them that their family legend was wrong. The Marblehead Historical Society proved invaluable once again. Patricia helped me trace the Cabral family line through census, records, and church documents. Thomas had never married, but he had a brother, Manuel, who had settled in Marblehead and raised a large family. The current Cabral family included Thomas's great-great-nephew, a man named David Cabral who ran a fishing charter business out of Marblehead Harbor. According to Patricia, David was something of a family historian himself and might be willing to talk about Thomas. I found David at his boat, preparing for an afternoon charter. He was a weathered man in his 50s with kind eyes and the calloused hands of someone who'd spent his life working on the water. When I introduced myself and mentioned Thomas Cabral, his expression grew guarded. "What do you want to know about Thomas?" he asked. I took a deep breath and decided on honesty. I'm the lighthouse keeper at Beacon Point. I've been researching the Esperanza wreck, and I found some documents that might change what people believe about Elena Vasquez. David's face darkened. That woman brought nothing but shame to our family. Thomas never got over her betrayal. Spent his whole life believing he wasn't good enough, that she chose death over marriage to a poor fisherman. What if I told you that's not what happened? What if Elena never had a choice? For the next hour, I told David everything I'd discovered. I showed him photographs of Jeremiah's journal, the manifest with Elena's name, the other artifacts I'd found. I watched his expression change from skepticism to shock to a deep, profound sadness. "My God," he whispered when I finished. "Thomas carried that guilt his whole life. He died thinking she'd rather drown than marry him. She loved him," I said. I could see it in her photograph, read it in the letters. She came across an ocean to marry him. Jeremiah Blackwood stole that from both of them. David was quiet for a long time, staring out at the water. Finally, he asked, "What do you need from me?" "I need you to help me tell the truth. I need to contact the authorities about excavating beneath the lighthouse. And I need the Cabral family to know that Elena never betrayed Thomas. She died trying to reach him. And you think that will put her spirit to rest?" I hesitated. How could I explain that I'd spoken to Elena herself, that she'd asked for exactly this? "I think the truth has power," I said finally. "I think lies can bind us, even after death, and only truth can set us free." The excavation. It took 3 weeks to get the proper permits and assemble a team to excavate beneath Beacon Point Light. David Cabral used his connections in the maritime community to expedite the process, and the story of Elena Vasquez caught the attention of local media. The archaeologists found her exactly where Jeremiah's journal said she would be, buried in a crude grave beneath the lighthouse's foundation. Her remains were remarkably well preserved due to the salt air and the way she'd been wrapped in oiled canvas. More importantly, they found evidence that corroborated Jeremiah's account. Elena's injuries were consistent with surviving a shipwreck, not with suicide by drowning. There were also signs of trauma that suggested she'd been restrained, rope marks on her wrists that had been preserved by the same conditions that preserved her body. The coroner's report was unambiguous. Elena Vasquez had been murdered. The story made national news. Lighthouse keeper's century-old crime solved. Read the headlines. Elena's remains were given a proper Catholic burial in Marblehead's waterside cemetery, with members of the Cabral family serving as pallbearers. David gave a eulogy that moved everyone present to tears. "Elena Vasquez came to America with hope in her heart and love in her soul," he said. She deserves to be remembered not as a victim, but as a brave woman who crossed an ocean for love. Thomas, wherever you are, she kept her promise. She came to you. She tried. But even as Elena's body was laid to rest, I wondered if it would be enough. Would clearing her name truly free her spirit, or would she remain bound to Beacon Point Light by forces beyond my understanding? The final encounter. My question was answered that very night. I was back at the lighthouse, packing my belongings. My temporary position was ending early due to the excavation, and frankly, I was ready to leave. The past month had drained me emotionally and physically. I needed to get back to normal life, whatever that meant now. Around midnight, as I was boxing up the last of my things, I heard familiar footsteps on the stairs. But this time, they sounded different, lighter, almost joyful. Elena appeared in the kitchen doorway, but she looked transformed. Her dress was clean and dry, a beautiful blue gown that seemed to shimmer in the lamplight. Her hair was arranged delicately, and her skin had a warm, healthy glow. Most importantly, her eyes were no longer filled with sadness. They sparkled with peace and gratitude. "Sarah," she said, and her voice now carried the sound of gentle breezes rather than crashing waves. "Elena, you look different." She smiled, and it was radiant. "I am free. My name is cleared. My body is at rest, and Thomas knows the truth at last. Thomas knows. Death is not the end of love, Sarah. He has been waiting for me, just as I waited for him. We are together now, as we always should have been." I felt tears streaming down my face. "I'm so glad. You deserved peace, and you gave it to me. You and the Cabral family. You chose to seek truth when it would have been easier to ignore the past." Elena moved closer, and this time her presence felt warm rather than cold. "I have a gift for you in return. You don't need to give me anything, but I do." She reached into her dress and pulled out something that shouldn't have existed, a modern envelope with my name written on it in elegant script. "Open it when you are ready for your next adventure." Before I could ask what she meant, Elena began to fade, but unlike her previous disappearances, this time she was dissolving into light rather than shadow. "Thank you, Sarah," her voice whispered as she vanished. "Thank you for bringing us home." The letter. I didn't open Elena's letter until I was back in Boston, settled into a new apartment and a new job. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper with an address in Salem, Massachusetts, and a brief note. "The Whitmore house has been empty for 40 years, but it is not abandoned. Margaret Whitmore waits there, just as I waited at the lighthouse. She died in 1984, but her story was never told. She needs someone brave enough to listen, someone willing to seek the truth. You have a gift, Sarah. You can hear us when others cannot. You can help us find peace when others will not try. Margaret is not the only one waiting. There are others, so many others, who need someone like you. Think about it, but do not feel obligated. You have given me more than I ever dared hope for. With eternal gratitude, Elena." I researched the Whitmore house online. It was a Victorian mansion that had been left to the city by its last owner, Margaret Whitmore, a reclusive woman who had died alone under mysterious circumstances. The house had been on the market for decades, but no one would buy it. The real estate listings mentioned unusual phenomena and potential structural issues, but reading between the lines, I suspected the problems were more supernatural than structural. I drove out to Salem the following weekend. Just to look, the Whitmore house sat on a tree-lined street, towering over its neighbors like a Gothic cathedral. Even in daylight, it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Several windows were broken, and ivy covered most of the first floor, but the structure appeared sound. As I stood on the sidewalk, studying the house, I could swear I saw a curtain move in one of the upper windows. A figure stood there briefly, an elderly woman in a white dress, watching me with the same desperate intensity I'd seen in Elena's eyes. Margaret, I thought. She's waiting. I haven't decided yet whether to answer Elena's call. Part of me wants to return to normal life, to pretend that my experience at Beacon Point Light was an isolated incident. But another part of me, the part that grew stronger every day, knows that Elena was right. I do have a gift. I can hear the voices of those who cannot rest, and maybe, just maybe, I can help them find peace. If you've made it this far in my story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain? Ever felt a presence in an empty room? Heard footsteps where no one was walking? Seen a figure that disappeared when you looked directly at it? I used to think people who claimed to see ghosts were either lying or delusional. Now I know better. The dead don't always rest easily, especially when they've been wronged, forgotten, or silenced. Sometimes they need someone from our world to help them find their way to whatever comes next. I'm still deciding whether to investigate the Whitmore house. What would you do in my position? Would you walk away from a normal life to help spirits find peace? Or would you convince yourself that some mysteries are better left unsolved? Let me know in the comments, because honestly, I could use the advice. And if you have your own paranormal experiences to share, I'd love to hear them. Maybe together we can figure out why some of us seem to attract these encounters while others go through life never seeing or hearing anything unusual. One thing I know for certain, Elena Vasquez is at peace now. On clear nights, when I look out at the ocean, I sometimes see two figures walking hand in hand along the shore, a young woman in a blue dress and a man in fisherman's clothes. They fade with the morning light, but they always return, no longer searching, but simply enjoying each other's company for eternity. That's the real gift Elena gave me, not just the knowledge that love survives death, but the understanding that sometimes the living have to help the dead find their way home. The question is, am I brave enough to do it again?